All right, Jim, you've been advising employees and employers for a long time. So what's a common issue that you see when you're talking with employees, like from the employee perspective?
Well, their employers are terrible. But that's the only people I talk to, are people who do a good job and they're treated poorly at work. If somebody has a good boss and they're good employees, they never talk to me. We're never going to hear from them. They're going to go through their entire working life without ever having to speak to someone. However, when employers do mistreat their employees, they talk to me. And one of the big problems that they have, and it fluctuates, is being paid overtime.
So if you have situations, I assume, where somebody might be paid as a contractor, but and not getting overtime, and maybe they should be paid as an employee, in which case they would get overtime. Is that something that you see?
Right. So very often employers will try to classify their employees as either contractors or as salaried paid. So a contractor is someone who has their own business, has their own tools, decides their own schedule, has their own marketing plan. They come in and they bid a job and they do it. The person who hires them doesn't tell them how to pound a nail or how to produce something, how to program. They're just told to do the job and they'll get a flat fee for that. It's negotiated. An employee, on the other hand, has to clock in, is told where to go. This is their only job or their main source of income, and they take their marching orders, so to speak, from the employer. And they're typically paid at an hourly rate. There's a very old law in this country called the Fair Labor Standards Act that presumes that everyone is being paid by the hour for their work. There are exceptions to that, which includes salary paid people. But that law also sets up, Dustin, some criteria. People have to make at least $55,000 a year, somewhere near that. And they have to do work that isn't production related. And they also get paid the same amount each week, no matter how much they work.
So you could have somebody calls you and they think they're entitled to overtime because they've been misclassified as a contractor, but you also could have somebody who is on payroll, they are an employee, and they're not being paid overtime because the employer thinks that they qualify under the salary exemption.
It's very insightful, Dustin, and that's what happens a lot. It's easy for an employer to say to their worker, hey, you're on salary now. You get the same amount each week.
Right.
The employee typically thinks that's great. And there's also they feel like maybe they've been promoted because salaried people are typically higher in the workforce. But that isn't the case. Very often, somebody who's working for an hourly wage doing work that would never be classified as salary it would make more money with overtime.
Yeah.
And they give that up, sometimes willingly, sometimes unknowingly.
Right. And it seems like sometimes from the employer's perspective that it's just easier to put everybody on salary. We don't have to keep track of hours. And it sounds like it's not quite that simple.
It isn't that simple. Yeah. Employees aren't required to determine what their status is under the law. That is the employer's job. So the employer will often tell them, here's how we'll pay you. It is a rare employee who will say, wait, that's not how it's supposed to be. I am not doing salaried work here. I should be entitled to regular hourly wages and overtime pay. An employer may say, no, we always do it this way. We always pay our people salary. This is the way to go. They do that for their own personal benefit, sometimes out of malice, sometimes out of ignorance. But there's a very large amount of money not being paid to employees every year because of misclassification. So it is a big deal.
Right. So back to the independent contractor situation. What ultimately decides? Should somebody be a contractor or should someone be an employee? Does the employer decide? Does the employee decide? Like, what controls?
This question rages on and on. I've heard it at panel discussions, at bar association meetings, and I've heard it through our clients. There is a test or two under the law. The state of Ohio has a test. The Fair Labor Standards Act has a test, a judicial test that's modified. It's gone up and down over time. The Department of Labor has just issued a new regulation that tells employers this is how to determine whether an employee is a contractor or an employee. And
so even if I have an agreement, if I'm a contractor and you and I have an agreement that says I agree to be an independent contractor, that's not always enforceable?
Heck no.
Yeah.
And that's just another way that employers will say, here's your employment agreement, sign off on that. This makes you an independent contractor and you agree to that. And sometimes when people want a job, they'll sign off on that and they'll say, this is great. I don't have to pay payroll taxes. My check will be X amount with no deductions. Of course, they forget that at the end of the year, if they get paid like that, they still have to claim their income and then pay taxes, and they have to pay employment taxes that their employer didn't take out. But it isn't for the employer to tell them that. An employee cannot waive their right to be paid hourly and overtime. And an employer cannot have an employee agree to not be paid what they're supposed to be paid under that law. It cannot be waived. It's clear from the Supreme Court decisions from 1938 forward that an employee cannot waive their right to collect, nor can they give it up.
So let's say there's a situation where an employee has been misclassified. They call you, you go through this analysis, and whether they're misclassified as a contractor or misclassified as an overtime exempt employee.
Right.
What's the risk to the company?
This is the beauty. From an employee's perspective or from an employment lawyer's perspective, the risk to an employer is gigantic. The Fair Labor Standards Act says that if you prove that an employee was not paid properly, overtime for instance, or even minimum wage, that the employee is entitled to collect the unpaid overtime or minimum wages doubled. And that extra amount is called liquidated damages, which is presumably to pay the employee for having not been properly paid over the period. And also the law requires the employer to pay the employee's attorney's fees. So there is no get away from that. It is not discretionary on the court's part. So an employer can be stuck paying for 1, 10, 50, 100 different employees if the action calls those people in. They're back overpay or back overtime, doubled plus my fees. So it is a powerful law, and it has been used well over the past 20 years that I've been doing that kind of work. It is a huge cudgel to an employer. It is unwise for an employer to think that they can shirk that law, because it only takes one disgruntled employee to come to me and say, hey, I wasn't getting paid overtime, because then I want every employee that employer's ever had for the past 3 years, and I'll go looking for them.